Welcome everyone to this online event. Can everyone hear me fine? Great. So I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming the panelists and the audience for the third of a series of events that has been organized with the support of the Arts and Sciences, the Committee on Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity, and with the Hyman Center for the Humanities and the Society of Fellows. And I'm grateful to Anya Wilkening for all of her coordination and her logistical support for this entire series, in which this is the third event. The panelists this evening are joining us from places near and far, not only on the Columbia campus. We have, and I'm speaking now kind of in reverse order for the near part of it, we have Michelle Wilson of Digital Publishing in the Columbia University Libraries, and Alex Giel, who is the Digital Scholarship Librarian in the Columbia University Libraries. We also have Lena Dawes, who is a doctoral candidate in ethnomusicology at Columbia and who has been the editor of Current Musicology, which is published by the program that Michelle Wilson oversees. We have Diane Reilly, who is my co-editor of the journal Gesta, which is published by the University of Chicago Press for the International Center of Medieval Art. Diane is a professor of art history at Indiana University in Bloomington. And we have Joy Calico joining us from Vanderbilt, who has been a past editor of the Journal of the American Musicological Society. And so our theme this evening is to figure out or brainstorm or discuss some ways in which we could promote greater equity and inclusion and diversity in the publishing of peer-reviewed journals, particularly thinking with a view toward the inside, that is, what are the kinds of ways in which we as editors of journals, also as participants in peer review, and as authors and as people involved in the larger landscape of publishing, as scholars, what ways can we think about potentially improving the situation that we have been discussing in the first two of these events, in the first two events of the series. So everyone will be speaking a bit from particular points of view. This is a highly interdisciplinary group, and a group that is representing journals with very different histories and different ways of functioning and different kind of operating conditions. So I want to welcome everybody and thank all the panelists very warmly for participating. And I'd like to start by speaking very briefly about some of the challenges to diversity and inclusion and equity in the publishing of peer-reviewed journals that I have experienced as a co-editor, and then Diane will be following me and expanding on this theme. So one of the things that we found by having both our own editorial experiences and also discussion with other editors and others involved in journals is that once one identifies changes that would be good to make, that process of making change is not an easy one. One cannot by fiat introduce change. Journals are subject to various kinds of conditions. They may have constraints upon the autonomy of the editors. They have relationships with the publishers who publish the journals. Even university presses have their own constraints. And the editors are also in conversation with and subject to the scholarly societies that publish the journals. So the editors are not acting, in the case of Gesta or the Journal of the American Musicological Society, the editors are not acting as autonomous agents who can simply make decisions. And proposals go through committees, they go through discussions, they go through many, many tiers of different mediators. And so what are some of the things that Diane and I have thought about doing that we could actually do without necessarily the mediation of the scholarly society, of the publisher, and so on? And I think that my theme for this evening is thus small things. We can do small things. And I think that small things have quite a bit of potential to be lasting. I think small changes can actually ultimately have an impact, and I believe in small is beautiful. So one of the things that we've done is diversifying the editorial board and thinking about the editorial board as a place to bring in a greater diversity of perspective, of different possible field representations and subfield representations. Also, we have consulted our editorial board on questions concerning diversity, equity, and inclusion, even just making sure that everybody is kind of involved in or aware of processes and decisions that are going on is something important to us. And when you think about it, editorial boards, they have a meaning. If somebody is on an editorial board, that's a line on their CV. It signals a kind of an ethical, intellectual certainly, but also kind of an ethical commitment to a journal, and it also signifies an involvement, a role in the conversation, a place at the table. And so thinking about who is on the editorial board and what message that sends is, to me, one important subtle way of creating diversity and inclusion. Thinking about where they are geographically, institutionally, where they are in relation to underrepresented populations, what perspective that they might bring that is not currently represented, and these are some of the roles that the editorial board also can go out and find or at least identify potential contributions, and that's why you want more different kinds of people on your editorial board. Now, another thing that we've done is we've done what we can, which is not very much, but we've done what we can on the question of open access. Because open access with our journal is limited, but we think very carefully about which articles, when they are selected to be in open access and not behind the paywall, what message does that send to our readers and to the society, and to art history generally, to the field, and also which authors and which kinds of subjects do we want. So I think open access, even when you can't really do a big open access kind of operation, you can use it in a way that increases diversity and inclusion. Another thing that we did was drop the requirement that any author who submits an article to Gesta, be a member of the Scholars Society, which is the International Center of Medieval Art, which sponsors the journal, because many people reported this was perceived as a barrier to bringing in more and more scholars from different fields, from different countries, etc., from different groups. Another thing that we thought of more recently was the affiliation line. This seems like an absolutely minuscule thing, but it used to be that the top of the journal, it would say the author's name and then the affiliation, which means that a person who's an independent scholar, unaffiliated, or depending on the institution, it marks that person in a certain way. It kind of identifies people in relation to their institutional affiliation. And Diane and I felt that we would like for the research to be foremost in this, in the presentation of articles. So, like other journals, we did the same. We moved the affiliation line to the end of the article, so it's still there, but what's foregrounded is the author's name and the title of the article. And therefore, a person's non-affiliated status, which is an increasing concern in this time period, does not appear at the head of the article. And people don't think of the institution. Now, another thing that we did also that I think is important personally to me is that we have been working to make the online submission system more user-friendly, because we have found that the online submission system, which is Editorial Manager, which is notoriously thorny, it actually creates barriers for authors. It makes it harder for authors to submit. It makes it intimidating for authors. It also tends sometimes to be discouraging to authors of a certain age. So we feel like there's an ageist element to it. There's also a bandwidth element in which, submissions are blocked because of people's internet access. So we've been working really in concert with several different people to figure out ways that will make this a more user-friendly and efficient submission, to make everyone feel more welcome when they submit an article, to introduce, for instance, more detailed instructions for submissions. And finally, the last thing I wanted to say is that we feel that another aspect of our role is organizing workshops like this one, is getting the word out, because I think that one thing about diversity is the more people know what's going on, the more people have access to information, the more people will become involved in publishing, the more people will feel empowered and less intimidated to publish. And you can't always know who those people are. There are all kinds of diversity. There are all kinds of reasons that people might not feel included in academic publishing. They might not feel welcome submitting their article to a peer-reviewed journal. And so I think the more we do these kinds of events and talk about the nuts and bolts and encourage transparency, I hope that this will help a larger scholarly community. So speaking of the larger scholarly community, I'd like to turn it over to Diane. Diane, I remember that in our warm-up conversation, you were speaking about the issue of editorial labor. Would you like to speak on that topic, Diane?
Yes, thank you. And I'm actually going to relate an incident and the thought that it provoked that you experienced as well, because it comes from our role in as the co-editors of Gesta. So we are responsible for the peer review process. And this recent incident led me to think in depth about the process of developmental editing and the fact that this is often a very unrecognized but labor-intensive activity that we commit to as being the editors. So we had a submission that was in a certain specialization, and we sent it to a former member of the editorial board and solicited a referee report from him. We heard back from him after he had read the article, and he castigated us for not, as he said, pre-screening articles. He said that he advised us to avoid passing on articles that were obviously narrow and have poorly developed arguments. And he guessed that the author of the article was an ill-advised undergraduate or maybe a graduate student. In fact, this was a very senior scholar who had published an article in Gesta before. And this is not the first time that we've had this kind of critique. When we read through the details of the review that this person had provided, it turned out that the problem wasn't really with the narrowly construed argument or poorly structured contribution. Instead, he was criticizing the lack of consultation of field-specific bibliography. So this did give me an opportunity, though, to step back and sort of contemplate, should we have sent this out? Was there a step that we missed? And to write to him and assure him, based on some data, that we actually are careful about what we send out, so in order not to waste our reviewers' time. So what I discovered in the process of doing this examination was that in a one-year period, we had received 28 new submissions. So these were not resubmissions or things that were already in the pipeline. Instead, these were totally new. The 10 of them were given a desk reject result almost immediately. Only 2 were accepted after the first round of review. So that tells you that most of the things that we eventually publish, because we publish between 8 and 10 articles a year, actually have to go through a very substantial review and revision process. 10 of the submissions that we received of that 28 were advised to revise and resubmit. And 6 of them at that point, we were still waiting for 1 review. Most likely, none of those would be entirely rejected. In fact, we almost never get 2 external referee reports that advise, that agree that an article should be rejected. It's remarkable. Referees see very different things. So one of the things I took away from examining this process was the realization that we have to do developmental editing on almost all of the articles we receive, whether or not they come from junior scholars or senior ones. Even people who are very experienced in writing scholarship often need direction on how they're going to structure an article to be effective, and also the specialist critiques that we receive from referees can lead them to completely reworking an argument. This is one of the values of the referee process, as painful as it is. One thing I told this cranky external referee was that when he seemed to think that we should have known that this scholar had missed some of this pre-existing scholarship, actually, we haven't read the entire literature of the field of medieval art history, and we rely on our specialist referees to provide those kinds of insights for us. We don't do developmental editing before we send a contribution or a submission out to referees. We don't have time. It's an extremely time-consuming process, and developmental editing is something that improves an article that we consider is potentially viable. But it doesn't necessarily need to be done before someone can see the seeds of greatness inside that submission, that someday this will be something that can be published in our journal. Most of the things we publish go through 2 or 3 rounds of revision. So it's a really long process. And the other thing that we both took away from this is that when we realized how much of this developmental editing was necessary in order to get these publications to see the light of day, we realized how uncompensated it is. So this is a really long-term process that we go through with each of these authors. Authors are often very grateful for it. They're grateful for the feedback they get. Some are less grateful and consider this to be intrusive. But neither of us have course releases from our institution. So we're doing this on top of full-time jobs that we already have. And we both realized in the process of examining this, that it's an equity issue, that in order for inexperienced scholars, especially people who are junior and haven't had the opportunity to be published in a journal like ours, a peer-reviewed journal before, they often need this kind of guidance. It's very different from the kind of feedback you would get on, say, a dissertation chapter. Creating something that's going to be published in a format that is appropriate for a scholarly journal is a very specific skill. And so one of the ways in which equity can be enhanced is if the process of developmental editing is supported. And that's one of the things that I think that institutions aren't really good at recognizing. Neither the institution where Susan is, Columbia, or where I am, Indiana University, actually creates the time and space for us to do developmental editing in an unrushed way. We do the best we can. All right, and I'll cede the floor at this point to our next speaker.
Ooh, could I add one thing though, Diane?
Yes.
One thing I think that we found was very challenging was the gradual realization that a lot of work that we do is actually clerical work that was for the journal, because we didn't have an editorial assistant, and there was a kind of I think that a lot of the work was taken for granted. The importance of editorial, the core editorial work, the developmental editing, is often taken for granted. It's extremely time consuming, and then the idea that you would then do a lot of other tasks alongside that was also being taken for granted. And for instance, the review of permissions, which is just the authorization to publish images, which is hugely time consuming, ended up being so large that we finally, with great difficulty, convinced the Scholarly Society to create a part-time position just for one tiny fraction of the work that we were doing. So I want to agree with Diane and then move on to our next speaker. And I see that before I do that, I just want to say that in the chat, there was a really interesting question about editorial boards, and I'm thinking, just because I have 2 minutes before in our little time frame plan, I wanted to bring that out because I don't want to ignore the things in the chat. So we have Ben, who says that he's only served on editorial boards when he was invited by a friend, and he thought of this as cronyism. He wonders what would happen if editorial boards were selected by lottery, welcomed open applications for vacancy, or elected by vote among society members. So actually, Ben, there are societies that have a way of applying to be on the editorial board, or that have other kinds of processes. In fact, the ICMA used to have a kind of a call for people to volunteer to be in the editorial board, and we finally realized that we didn't want to do that because we really needed very specific kinds of help on the editorial board. What we do with the editorial board is we send things and get opinions on them when they're outside of our own expertise. So we do need the editorial board to have a certain composition in terms of specialty, and although we're expanding that. So I think one thing to do would be for different societies to think more about what it means to be in the editorial board. But I wonder, that is probably the case, that a lot of times people are invited by friends. And indeed, sometimes people and that you can count on are the right people to invite to an editorial board because they'll do the work, And Ben is saying, interesting. Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that in music, maybe it isn't very open. I mean, I think that that was kind of an interesting realization for me is the role of editorial boards really does need to be thought about and scrutinized a little bit more. And, there's too many people who they're on the editorial board and they're just a name and they never do anything that you ask them to do and they say they're busy. Or there are editorial boards that make people do a huge amount of work, and that's treated the same as if it's just a name on the masthead, which of course it's not at all. So, but speaking of this whole question of peer review, which is one of the things editorial boards do is help determine whether something should be peer reviewed and by whom it should be peer reviewed. I wanted to turn the floor over to Joy Calico to talk about peer review as labor.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Musicological Society. I edited 3 volumes, so 3 calendar years worth of issues. And the job actually begins 10 months before that calendar. So it's almost a 4-year commitment. The Society, for those of you who are not members or aware of it, it has, as of today, about 2,700 members. Journal subscription is part of the membership. And in addition to that, there are 680 something institutional subscriptions and a varying mix of electronic only, paper only, or the two, or both. It's a journal that still publishes in both formats. So this has a whole set of issues attached to it. It is connected to, we are supervised by the board of the American Musicological Society. And in terms of, I want to pick up with what was just being said about board membership, that when I was editor-in-chief, I had to submit proposals for who could be on the board to the Society's board of directors, who vetted them. And sometimes before they even got to the full board, the president would look at them and say, oh, I've already assigned that person to some other big thing. You can't use that person for this purpose. So there are multiple layers in this context in terms of an attempt to diversify board membership, for example. So there are multiple ways in which this plays out. Peer review was a way in which I tried to make some headway in making academic publishing a more humane experience for authors. I did learn that authors have different thresholds of tolerance for what appears to be a harsh review or not. Not everyone perceives these things the same way, but I realized pretty quickly that when I sent out requests for peer review, we developed a document that talked about civility, appropriate tone, and that if people agreed to peer review, that I reserved the right to edit those things for tone, and which I did. I spent an inordinate amount of time doing that. And that led me to believe that we could really use some training on how to peer review, because I remember the first time I did peer reviews, I just wrote the kinds of things I had been receiving, which was not always, let's say, humane. So I think this is a place where not only people within the journal, but actually the discipline as a whole could do better. We use a double-blind peer review process. As far as I know, the journal still does that. My tenure ended in 2019, and at that point, there was not an appetite for open peer review, although that has become much more common. I have participated in that myself recently. I can certainly see how there would be advantages to that. So, but I am no longer the editor, and I don't know if that's something that's on the table. A couple of other things that we did in an attempt to increase the diversity of authorship, but also of topics of research in the journal. We had a special issue on music, race, and ethnicity that we worked on with what was then called the AMS Committee on Race and Ethnicity, but I'm sure that's no longer the name of it. Worked with the co-chairs, George Lewis, who's in the Columbia Music Department, and Judy Sao to develop a call for papers. And in an attempt to both diversify the types of scholarship that come in and get published in JAMS, and also who the authors might be. And This was part of an effort to increase junior scholar participation and acceptance. And in fact, that issue ended up with 5 articles in it, 4 of which were published by untenured, or one of them was even accepted, I think, when the author was still no, that's not true. They were all by 4 of the 5 of them were from junior scholars. So that was a special issue. It was, I know some journals do this as a matter of course, but it was the first one in a very long time in JAMS. We think 20 something years since there had been a special issue. And we decided not to have a guest editor because we thought it was important to signal that the society thought this was a significant topic. That was, so I edited that issue also. Something else we did is thinking about a commitment to junior scholars. And this is something that Diane has mentioned about developmental editing. It's very, very labor intensive. We've made a very strong commitment to making this work, but it takes a big commitment of time and intellectual energy. One of the things I didn't fully realize until I took this job was that, you know, in hindsight, duh, but that's the same type of intellectual energy I need for my own work. It is a finite resource. And that was something I had not entirely anticipated. But I'm pleased to report that in the 3 years of journal issues that our team edited, we ended up winning 10 prizes from 4 societies. 8 of those were to junior scholars, and 5 of those were for underrepresented groups in our discipline. So I think it's possible to do these things, but it's a commitment to soliciting submissions from scholars that you think may not think of your journal first, and also to committing to doing the developmental work that Diane and Susan have talked about. The other thing I was able to do, and this is just a freak of timing, because I went from editing the journal to being on the Society's board of directors. And that turned out to be a place where I could advocate for things I had been asking for as an editor, but was unable to get traction with. So this included the fact changing the way the editor was chosen. I was chosen I was appointed essentially by the board of directors. I had not ever expressed any interest in editing, and I had no idea this was happening. It seems, so I asked if there could be an application process. That is now the case. I asked if we could have an associate editor so that there's not one person bearing the brunt of all of this. That is also now the process. We worked with a new, more user-friendly submission portal. Although in that regard, we are also at the mercy of the University of California Press. We could only choose something that they were already using. But we tried to make all of those things part of a bigger picture of making publishing more accessible and equitable. There had been a discussion just as I became editor about open access, and then the executive director of the society, who had been very invested in that, died suddenly. And I don't know where the conversations are with that right now, but that's another topic that I think would be helpful.
Well, this is great. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, because this is a perfect segue into Alex. Alex Giel, because Alex Giel's journal is an open access journal. It was founded, it's born digital, archipelagos. It's born digital, it's born open access. And Alex is, he's going to talk about this, but one thing that strikes me always is that what Alex and then Kayama Glover, who's not here today, but who is his co-editor, what they were able to do with Archipelagos is what many journal editors would love to be able to do, but don't have that autonomy. As we've just all been discussing, you're subject to the publisher, subject to the Scholarly Society, subject to the board of the Scholarly Society. There's so many ways in which one cannot simply pick and choose things from the submission portal, all the way to the policies of peer review. And yet with Archipelagos, it was possible in almost a utopian manner to create a kind of a new landscape. So Alex, would you like to speak to us about how, with publishing a journal which is so pathbreaking, which is so new, and which is able to do so much, what are the kinds of issues that come up? You know, you were speaking with us in our warm-up conversation the other day about prestige, the whole issue of, okay, so you have this new journal, it hasn't been published for that many years, it has a reputation, but it is not one of the journals that may be the most prestigious, and yet it's one of the it's probably one of the highest quality in the subfield. So how do you negotiate, or how do you discuss, or how do you consider and frame those questions that are so important for junior scholars?
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I think you said the key word, which is negotiate. I'm going to represent today a sort of the point of view of the middle, a sort of like centrist who negotiates with existing prestige in order to be able to do experimental stuff outside of that traditional prestige. And it connects both to genre, the creation and formation of subfields, and diversity, race and gender, and class in very interesting ways that we have not written about. And I hope that we can use this time to actually explore some of these ideas together. I think I want to lay out for you a little bit of the disciplinary history that leads to the journal, and that leads to the way we did things to become autonomous, and specifically in the context of the larger discipline and the journals that were already established. Before I do the mini history, it's important to remark that sometimes some of the strongest advocates of open access sort of prefer not to talk about prestige. And that's why I asked you to let me talk to you. It is also true and that a lot of people associate open access with the absence of prestige as sort of automatic, as if the way in which you give access to your journal has something to do with the quality of the scholarship. It reminds me of Freud, who used to say that if you don't pay for the psychoanalysis, it ain't going to work. And I want you to keep that in the background as we go on this little mini history. So about 10 years ago, I started out in the digital humanities about 15 or 20, but about 10 years ago, I started working in Colombia. And one of my disciplinary homes is Caribbean Studies, which even then, 10 years ago, did not have a space for us to sort of discuss digital humanities as it relates to Caribbean Studies. Now, most of you in other subject disciplines probably already have journals that discuss music and the digital, history and the digital. All of these things exist and have proliferated. And some of them are achieving a relative degree of prestige. The problems that we saw were compounded by what we understood to be a sort of dominant space of the age to be mostly a white space. So it wasn't only disciplinary issues that we had. We also saw that the mainstream, the age, as it's called, the big conference with it has 600 to 700 people getting together every year in somewhere in the world, and it has thousands and thousands of members. The organization that runs this thing is called ADHO, and it's so big that it has national chapters. The national chapter of ADHO is the ACH, or Association for Computers in the Humanities, here in the United States. And most of these spaces have a huge, or are definitely improving, but at that particular moment in time, about 10 years ago, had a very big diversity issue when it came to race, but not only race, it also had a very big issue with gender at that particular time. In 10 years, we've been able to do fantastic work to change that ship around. But our own project is a small part of that world, and it comes from that history. When we set out to design and imagine what this journal would be, we wanted to do it in tandem with a conference. So we didn't want to associate ourselves necessarily to the professional organization, to the academic society of the time. I was an executive of the board of ACH, and I literally remember saying to the board, I don't want to bring Caribbean studies into the space. I wanted to create a space with my partners outside of a majority white space, at least for a while, just so that we can develop our own concerns rather than have, because, you know, when you're starting out, you right away see what are some of the things that are going to make you have to work to communicate, translate, in order to be accepted into majority white space. And at that particular moment, we felt that perhaps our energy, our labor should be better spent developing our own concerns in a sort of siloed or semi-siloed way through a conference and through the creation of this journal. The conference called the Caribbean Digital, and I could put the link in the chat, is now on its 8th year. And it was at that time the first minority white conference in digital humanities in the United States. And it continues to be a minority white conference. And he was thinking through that phenomenon of seeing what creating silos within the academy, which for better or worse, because I recognized right away the sort of long-term structural problems of if all of us do mini segregations along gender or race lines. I understand this is not going to lead to a sort of pluricultural liberal space that I hope we defend here together. It was needed for us, and it was salutary. It was actually phenomenal because we could develop our themes, we could develop methods around questions that were central to us without having to spend a single ounce of time thinking about how this would be received in the mainstream space. So the journal gets founded about a year after the conference is already going. The community is already, more of scholars is already forming. We have junior scholars, we have senior scholars, and we have people who come to this space to start doing the work of publication around some of the burgeoning work. A sort of creation of a or at least, I mean, there are many people have done the work before, but it was loose and it had never been gathered. So now we had a space where we can gather the scholarly work. And when we did this, we also, we knew that we couldn't simply just take that sort of open access tag of saying, who cares about the old world? We're just going to reinvent everything. It's perfectly feasible for us to say, we don't care about prestige. We don't care about any of this. We are the new kids in town, and we're going to revolutionize everything and do this journal our way, right? And that's that total autonomy, a sort of libertarian sort of position, where you're saying, I don't care about institutions, I don't care about tradition or anything. And we decided right away against that, because we knew that no matter how revolutionary we would not be able to actually help any people right away get jobs, get promoted. So this is one of those things all of us find ourselves caught between, the socialism we want and the capitalism we live in, right? The post-racial society we all want, the Black, white, Latino, and the sort of racial society that we live in, right? So you're always in between. So when I thank you for using the word negotiate, is because that is precisely the type of negotiation that I'm talking about. Negotiation between all of these spaces, existing and future. The journal itself congeals. It actually is a manifestation, the precipitate of that negotiation between different types of spaces, the space of traditional prestige, of rewards in this world and the one we are living in, while we change it, while we create these new forms that coexist with it. And I'll illustrate with the example of the journal itself. Now, the first thing we did was we didn't actually decide to go and run off and create our own prestige right away. We attach ourselves to the flagship journal. So we convinced David Scott, who has been running, professor of anthropology here at Columbia, who has been running the flagship journal for Caribbean studies for about 20 years now. It wasn't the flagship journal when it started out 20 years ago, but it's definitely the flagship journal of Caribbean studies today in 2022. It is called Small Axe. So in the first 3 issues of our journal, we will call Small Axe archipelagos. So 4 years into it is when we decide, we ride we used to call it Dad's Cadillac. So we ride Dad's Cadillac for 3 years just to establish ourselves, to sort of like to establish our credentials, but right away then it's received by people in Caribbean studies as the real thing, because obviously it has to be if it's attached to the Small Axe brand. It's been vetted by David and the editorial board of Small Axe. It must be the real thing. And then fast forward, and 4 years into it, then we agree, everybody agrees that it's time now to strike out completely on our own. Once once we sedimented the credentials. And it's of course, and this was our goal always. Even David Scott knows. So David Scott knows. It's like, I'm going to lend you the Cadillac, but the idea is that we really want you to create that subfield. But like at the end of the day, when you create that subfield, that you don't have any doubts about whether you were able to create it because you were writing on the Caribbean Studies flagship. And we all agreed this from the get-go. And on issue 4 is when we finally decided to implement it. So there's that negotiation between sort of the traditional prestige of like where to publish. This is the first question that every junior faculty asks. I just came from CUNY on last Friday on their professional development for publishing conference. They've been doing it for 20 years. It's a fellowship program where all their junior faculty in the social sciences and the humanities get together and they on workshops with senior scholars, and the senior scholars would sit down with them and we help them more or less figure out where to publish, since that is the number one question they always ask. Where should I publish in order to get tenure, right? So we answer that question. We negotiated with the where to publish by writing with a place that will be top 1 answer for where to publish when it comes to Caribbean studies. And then we set out. So that's the traditional prestige question. Their second type of prestige question is the question attached to the material product itself of a journal as a genre. So there are 2 genres that are identified as the products of knowledge that are recognized by tenure and promotion boards across the world. And that is the monograph, the book, and the journal article for the humanities and social science. But I want you to think about it materially. I want you to think about this as a specific genre, not necessarily the only 2 possible material outcomes of a scholarly process, or the only 2 possible ways of communicating the results of your research. Now, this is a question that digital humanities asks of us all the time, because books and journals is not what we do. I mean, we have to end up doing them if we want to get tenure, or if graduate students want to, get their degrees and get out without less debt, hopefully. They have to end up writing in this traditional genres. I should add the dissertation as a 3rd genre there. But a lot of what we do is maps, digital archives, digital editions, etc. Things that may have metonymical relationship or metaphorical relationship to these paper formats that have been settled in the landscape of the university, of the academy for the past 200 years, don't have that prestige, the material prestige yet. So this is where the journal is also a negotiation of genre and materiality. The link is there. Anya was kind enough to put it on the chat. If you open the journal, you will notice that we're in issue 5 is the last one because of the pandemic. We're a little bit behind on the next one, which is coming out next week, issue number 6, which I was working on earlier today. So if you look at the top section, number 1 section, there's an editorial introduction always. And then the second section is called essays. Now, that is a traditional double-blind peer review in the traditional sense. What we are signaling by putting that section there at the top to the scholarly community is, look, we can do the traditional stuff. We even have it. We have these essays in PDF so that you can put them in a scholarly repository. You can print them out. We do the traditional stuff. Double-blind. Argumentative essays, they have to have a critical argument. Nothing gets passed. Both us in that through our desk before we send it out to reviewers, or our reviewers, unless it has an intervention, an actual, honest to God, traditional intervention. No argument, no playtime on valence number 1. Valence number 2 and valence number 3, though, are completely new. Nobody had ever done this before. Valence number 2 is a single blind review of a digital humanities project, or a process piece, the sort of essay we called also the "we done good" essay, which is not really making an argument. It's just talking about, hey, we did this cool thing where scholars work for like 3 years, and like we just want to show it to the world. So the problem with this review is it cannot be double blind, because digital humanities projects, as you can imagine, already publish the name of the person who's doing them once they're online. We already know the teams involved in any given project. We cannot hide the author or authors, as is mostly the case in digital humanities. So what we did there is we actually at least negotiated a little middle ground where we actually do single blind review and then just publish the conversation anonymized between the reviewers and the people who did the project. And then valence number 3, the final section, is a section that imitates the book review, but does it for digital humanities projects. This is a genre that at least should be recognizable to most of us, which is something has been published. And then we're going to ask somebody post-publication to please come and look at it and tell us what they think. Just give us a quick review, this 2-pager, right? That we've all done for books. But now we're doing it for digital humanities. So I'm going to close there, but I wanted you to consider these 2 forms of prestige that we're negotiating as sort of like the takeaway from my comments today, which is that, and the belief that a sort of negotiating position is a diversity issue. As we do things, and you guys, and Diane, Joy, Susan, and so you guys are stuck within the rigid, super pristine cathedrals that you don't have to fight for prestige. Those have been building prestige for decades, right? The thing is that your autonomy becomes lesser and lesser and lesser for you to the more prestigious and settled and established it is, the less and less autonomy you have. And the thing is that with diversity, we kind of need, in order to create access for people who have been excluded, my instinct tells me that we need to have a little bit more autonomy if we're going to do this right, in order to accomplish this. So I'm not saying, of course, quit your position and start a new journal, but at least, but at least let's start having this conversation and create spaces where we incentivize people to create this middle ground spaces. So I think Small Axe did it right by creating little sub-journals that allow you then to explore other possibilities. Those might be the possibilities that actually may open the door in the future. And there may be other ways of reimagining what a negotiation looks like. These are complex structures that we must think through carefully, but my general incentive is, let us imagine those middle spaces. Let us imagine those spaces of negotiation between the old and the new and diverse and inclusive world that we want to build. Thank you.
Well, that was incredibly useful, Alex. Thank you so much for those thoughts. And I also want to say it actually reminds me of a conversation that was had about a structural possibility of a similar kind of journal, a subjournal that when we were with Gesta, the publications committee was or the editorial board were talking about this at some point, and it wasn't feasible at the time. But I think the way that you're framing it as the middle ground, I really think this is really important, because we can't, as you say, we can't all go and found new journals, but there can be a way of working towards a middle ground and trying to also to speak very honestly about what it means to be under the constraints of the scholarly societies, of their boards, of the publishers, to speak very openly about it, to speak, we've been trying to push ourselves, but everybody should really give a lot more autonomy to editors, I think. Because it takes a lot for editors to do the work and to get into those positions. Joy talked about a transition in the way thanks to Joy, a transition in the way the editor is chosen for that position, Diane and I had to apply for our editor position. And, there are many, the whole question of how do you become the editor of a journal is actually a very relevant question to raise in this context. Now, I want to bring to turn over the microphone, so to speak, to our next speaker, Lena Dawes, because she has been the editor-in-chief of a journal, Current Musicology, which exists in a slightly different institutional framework. It is in the Department of Music at Columbia. It was founded in the Department of Music at Columbia actually more than 75 years ago, and it is run entirely by graduate students at Columbia. So they have, of course, a limited term, and and they become editors of Current Musicology for different reasons from the reasons that people become editors of some of the other journals that we've been talking about. So Lena has a really interesting perspective on these questions from partly, she's a writer otherwise and is a published author, but from the perspective of Current Musicology, I think will give us some more insight into some of these issues. So please, Lena.
Oh, thank you, Susan. Yes, and just from listening to the previous conversations today, I realized that there's a little bit more information about Current Musicology I should probably mention. In terms of how I became the editor, I was thinking about when I was the editor. It was between 2018 and 2020. There have been two new editors since my time. And so I first wanted to talk about how we get on the editorial board at Current Musicology. So as part of the graduate fellowship application, in our third year of our PhD program, we do have the option to choose which way we want to go. What kind of fellowship work do we want to do for the music department? So the majority of my colleagues would go into being a teaching assistant for Western Music Humanities, which is one of our core music programs for undergrads, or Asian Music Humanities. And then there is the option to join Current Musicology. So for the first year, you would serve as an associate editor. And then the second year, if people like what you do, you become the editor-in-chief. So for me, because of my background as a music journalist, as a published author, and some of the other work I did before I attended graduate school, I wanted to get into the editorial position because this is something that I had previously worked in. So what we do is we submit our application. We then have an interview with one of the music faculty. And if we are approved, then we are able to get this position for the next school year. So that is exactly what I did. So in that process, one of the things about Current Musicology is the first issue was published in 1965. So there is a long and storied history with Current Musicology, which means that anyone who is in an editorial position for the journal, there's a certain weight that is placed upon you. One of the things that I did was look through, previous issues. And you see some of the scholars that were published maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago are extremely established. The articles are incredibly insightful, but it does put pressure on, I'll just say myself, because you want to continue on that legacy of supreme and incredibly well-written articles. We do have an editorial board, and I guess I also wanted to mention that the way how our editorial board is shaped is a little bit complicated. So for instance, what we did the first year when I started was my editor that I worked with when I was assistant or associate, we would hold a open house. So that means that we would usually, cater in a lunch. We would invite graduate students from all of the disciplines within the music department to come eat lunch, and then we do our spiel about why we need them to be working with us for the duration of the school year. So we do sign up forms, and so we have certain positions in terms of, would you like to be a proofreader? Would you like to be a reviewer? If we need graphic design help, what kind of talents and skills do our colleagues have in the music department that we can utilize for current musicology? So we usually, garner a list. And I think one of the things that I found frustrating when I was editor in chief is that list of people, we create a database and we have everybody's duties. So when we do need something like peer review, we can go onto our list and find out who is available to not only do the peer review, but also what their discipline is. And we match the article to the discipline or the interests of the graduate student that we ask to do the review. So that way, that person is reading and critiquing the writing based on their own educational and personal background. However, that editorial list, it gets published in our journal. We have both print and we have an open access website. But as was mentioned previously, we find that when you really need some help and you go back to that editorial board, there's no one there to help you because everybody is busy. They might not like, someone on the editorial board. There's all these different reasonings why people at the last minute cannot do the help that you really need them to do, even though they're on an editorial board. So I was thinking about my recent experiences in the last year. I was invited by some European scholars of my discipline. I study heavy metal scholarship and race. And so there's a number of, most of my colleagues in this discipline are in Europe. And so they invited me to be on 2 editorial boards for the same publishing company. So we're doing an academic imprint for heavy metal scholarship, and we're also doing an imprint for general readership. So I can definitely tell you that I will have more editorial board duties for these 2 German imprints than I was faced with with Current Musicology. So after the process, we do have a very good relationship in terms of going back and forth with the authors. We will not hesitate to decline papers if they are not written in a way that the revision process will be, done in a sufficient manner. I was very particular about getting back to 2 issues, printing 2 issues a year. That has been the standard, and previous to my time, there was a massive problem. We were very, very, very behind. So based on those issues, one of the things that I really wanted to talk about was, I guess, the positives and the negatives. The positives for me was working for a very well-established and very well-respected journal. I would go to academic conferences and people would say, oh, I see that you're the editor of Current Musicology. I use that as a resource in my studies. So that's always great, but it also puts pressure on you that you want to make sure that everything that you publish is well written, well edited. You have a good working relationship with your authors and making sure that you are addressing their needs, which I feel that within the 2-year span, I was able to do. The challenges is that this is being managed by graduate students, and we all are very, very busy. And one of the problems I had was constantly negotiating with the music financial department. Lovely, very patient people, because I was running in there probably every week to get some help. We had to pay people extra just to do this job, which in previous years was voluntary. We just couldn't get people to work. So luckily, we were able to take money out of our budget, and we were able to pay people a little bit of a small stipend to help us with just rigorous proofreading a final read through, just making sure that everything was perfect before we sent it to the printer. I must also give a excuse me, a massive shout out to Michelle Wilson, who really helped us, because in that 2-year process, we also updated the website, which I'm very proud of. And we also did a lot of archival work. And so if it wasn't for Michelle's guidance on that, we really cleaned up kind of the financial administrative aspects of the of current musicology, which desperately needed to be done probably 10 years prior to my being an editor there. So I think that one of the issues is that how do you convince your fellow graduate students to take this job seriously? And how do you convince people such as myself, who was going through my general examinations to become a candidate, and now as I'm in dissertation revisions right now, so I'm very stressed out. How do you get people who are legitimately busy to dedicate their time, or at least keep their commitment to maintaining this very well established journal? And so unfortunately, I believe that, and one thing I do want to mention, as an ethnomusicologist, so what happens when we do apply to be an assistant editor or an editor-in-chief at Current Musicology, is what the faculty likes to do is they like to ensure that if I'm doing, I'm an ethnomusicologist, I do it 2 years, the next person is in historical musicology or in composition, and that kind of shapes the kind of the ethos of the journal issues. So if I'm doing ethnomusicology, I'm not saying that I want 5 ethnomusicologists to write excellent papers, but I feel that my worldview, because of my discipline, is shaping it in a certain way. So the next editor after me, Callum, who did an amazing, my mind just blanked. He did an amazing job in terms of shaping the journal the way, coming from his point of view and his discipline. But the problem I had was when I was asking and trying to get articles and submissions and help, I did not really receive a lot of help from my fellow classmates in terms of, can you come help us this year? We're trying to get this issue out. I was lucky and fortunate enough to put together a special issue, which I'm very proud of, which is queering and querying musicology. And I believe that was a very well-received journal. But I found that being an ethnomusicologist and potentially probably being a Black woman, where there's not very many of us in the department, that people were not as receptive to me as being an editor as they were to my prior and past colleagues who are now editors-in-chief or assistant editors. So that, in terms of diversity and race and music, the study of music, it's challenging to be in that position. I also felt that I spent quite a lot of time, twice as much as I was getting paid as a graduate student to do, and which I found very frustrating. But I did feel that I took on this position and I had a certain level of responsibility, and so I just did the job. But I'm also 20 years older than some of my classmates and my colleagues. So what do you do when you get a 25-year-old newly minted doctoral student who is interested in taking over this journal? We need training, we need more training, and luckily for me, I was able to go to faculty that I trusted and get their advice, and always covered and always asked questions and always said, hey, I'm not sure about this, what can I do? But that comes from a sense of my own maturity and my own paranoia that I didn't want to screw anything up. But not everyone is like that. So I'm really hoping that in future years that we do have more advanced training for the graduate students who are interested in current musicology. And we do encourage graduate students to reach out to either, Butler Library and Michelle, not to put more work on you, Michelle, but we do really want to encourage people to ask for help and to really understand the history of current musicology. It's a fabulous journal. And I've used it for my own dissertation work. There are some incredible scholars from the music department at Columbia who have donated their time to write for us. And I think that that is something that we should be very honored to. And so very quickly before I end, I just also want to mention that in terms of who is submitting to current musicology. So I would say when I was editor-in-chief, we had maybe 70% were coming from external other universities, independent scholars, people from all over the world. And we had a very small percentage of people who were graduate students from other departments at Columbia. We had some amazing authors, but they were comparative literature, history, and they just found current musicology and wanted to submit. And we were very lucky to have them. So I do also would hope that in later years at Columbia, that we get more graduate students who are willing to submit their articles, and we need to do a little bit more marketing in terms of getting Africana Studies, for instance, or the Center for Ethnicity and Race, and students from other or languages, and especially Indigenous and Middle Eastern students to come to our, and to think about applying to or submitting to current musicology, because we definitely do need diversity, even though I think that in the last 10 years, my prior, the editor that I worked under did a fantastic job at just choosing people who he felt had a unique voice and a unique perspective about music scholarship. And so that really helped me, and he really mentored me a lot, and I appreciate it. But we have to keep on the mentoring in terms of pushing it forward with the newly minted editors, assistant, and EICs to make sure that they understand that this is really an important journal, and it would be a real shame for it to fall through the cracks. Thank you.
Wow, this is really helpful, Lena, because I think you've raised a lot of really important issues that I hope that we'll talk about more. And I do think that the whole question of your position as an editor-in-chief, of being a woman, of being a Black woman, being from an underrepresented group, and also the gender questions. I think I know anecdotally from Joy, I know from myself and Diane's experience, that being a female editor-in-chief comes with a great many it can come with a great many kind of fraught or conflictual encounters that you might not actually have if you were a male editor-in-chief. I mean, so this is something that people, I think, don't acknowledge often enough. Now, I wanted to turn to Michelle Wilson. We're running a little bit late, but I feel like we will still have time for plenty of discussion. Michelle Wilson joins us from the library's publishing program, and we've already heard how much she's done for current musicology. And so, yeah, I mean, Michelle, would you like to speak about your perspective on all these issues that we've been raising here? There's, of course, a whole host of issues, but I know you have the bird's eye view.
Yeah, but Lena teed me up very perfectly to talk about something that is very important to me and how I run our library publishing program at Columbia, which is supporting students in the publishing process and mentoring students who are involved in publishing. We publish quite a large percentage of the catalog that we publish through the library is actually student journals. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that a lot of students who wish to have their own publications or emerging scholars are looking for outlets to do their own publishing or see a gap. And so the library, as an open access publisher, not we're not terribly concerned with, whether or not the publication right off the bat is the most impactful or prestigious is going to make us a lot of subscription revenue. As the library, we're here to provide services for the community, and to the extent that we can give graduate students and emerging scholars some of the experience that Alex was talking about of being able to find a place where they can have a community that reflects their values, feels inclusive, allows them to talk about an emerging, discipline or a subject area that isn't well represented in traditional catalogs with commercial publishers. We publish, or have been publishing, an increasingly large number of student journals that are in non-Western topics and have majority non-white communities. So our Journal of Tibetan and Himalayan Studies, Waxing Moon, or our new undergraduate Columbia Journal of Asia, which is an Asian Studies journal. And these are really important opportunities, I think, for students not only to have some of the positive experience of participating in a publishing community, but especially if they are advised and mentored, for them to really develop and inculcate some of these types of inclusive practices that we're talking about today, so that when the next generation of editors rises up into the positions that you are all sitting in now, they will hopefully approach some of these ways of writing calls for papers, thinking about constructing editorial boards, and doing editorial and peer review practice in a way that is more inclusive. So for our journals, for example, we work very hard, especially with my undergraduates, on talking about and problematizing peer review. So some of our journals, even at the undergraduate level, are practicing open peer review rather than double blind, because we've had workshops and talked about some of the issues that come into play when you have a double blind system in terms of unconscious bias, or having students understand that double blind system can lead to uncollegiality, if we can call it that, and providing the students with, even if they are using a double blind peer review process, the opportunity to reflect on the way that they are introducing peer review guidelines, that they are structuring peer review reports. One of the examples that, is this article original versus in what ways is this article original, to coach people to have a productive conversation with the person whose article they're refereeing. And our undergraduate students invite graduate students to participate in the journal as peer reviewers. So they're also providing an opportunity for graduate students to have a formative experience in participating in publishing, from the other side, to participate as a peer reviewer, perhaps even before they're receiving their own first peer review. And hopefully, if we can create that welcoming environment where we're encouraging people to contribute in a positive, meaningful way to the experience of the author, they can then want to replicate that in the future when they are serving as peer reviewers in professional contexts. And, for the folks that are here, I would say that for graduate students, I think that it can be very powerful and really empowering to participate in a journal. So working on a graduate student journal, as Lena is describing, as a really great way to, have these experiences. I think in my experience of advising students who are going out to do their first publications as well, it can be very empowering to have served on an editorial board or in some capacity, so that you have that confidence of knowing what the process is like or what the process should be. So if you're not having a good experience of participating on a journal, you can find the community and the editorial board and editors who you want to work with to help you produce the best possible scholarship. But it's also very meaningful, I think, for those of you who are working as editors, as faculty members, to provide support and mentorship for students who are working in these publishing scenarios. I would also say that, to the extent that, it is time consuming, it can also be really meaningful to peer review for a graduate journal or for a student journal, and provide that level of mentorship and expertise to authors who are, working in that environment, or who are working to publish their first articles, but also the student editors who are working that environment, and they can really feel very supported when faculty members are willing to devote their time to provide that peer review and model the way that that peer review or that editing can happen in a really constructive way.
Well, thank you so much for speaking so eloquently about this need for mentoring. And I feel as if all of us in the panel today have been thinking about, in different ways, about mentoring, different kinds of mentoring, and the need for mentoring. And in some cases, the mentoring is very explicit, and the promotion or the support for younger scholars is very explicit. It's very much part of what you're doing. And in other cases, it's built in, but it could be done and practiced to a lesser or to a greater extent. So I think that maybe it would be great for us all to reaffirm our commitment to mentoring and what mentoring would mean in the context of journal publishing in the cases where it's not as routine or where it's not as perceived as built into the editor's work. I've spoken to editors of journals, and it's very clear that their understanding of what it means to be an editor of a journal is very, very different from mine. So I think that there could be great conversations among different editors. I wanted to just take another look at the chat because I see a question, I see a point from Ben. He says the context on non-blind review, history of law reviews, which are a very different kind of journal, and also this other one. I'm going to open both for Tour College. Yes, about the whole question of other forms of peer review. So while we're all still here, are there questions that people would like to put in the chat? I suppose people can also unmute themselves because we're not a huge group now, and ask their questions or make comments.
Just want to really quick just address the history of non-blind review to say, you heard my comments about having to negotiate between two different inside prestige, outside prestige, and the thing is that we couldn't take the risk of just going all the way to non-blind, even though that's something that I care about. I care a lot about this kind of public conversations and transparency, because I think they ultimately can be more useful than the behind the scenes conversations we have in order to ensure the quality. If the ultimate goal is just to have good scholarship, I think perhaps the non-blind review can probably get us there. But the problem is that I wasn't going to risk any young person's chances at promotion or getting hired, right. Especially people of color, the Latinos, indigenous people, Black people. Look, we're already facing a lot of other hurdles in order to demonstrate the value of what we do. I remember once a submission to a journal that led to a big scandal in the United States, where they, for the first time in that journal, they asked, they were doing a specialist on post-colonial digital humanities, and they asked us, I was a guest editor, and me and my other guest editors, they literally asked us to have 2 rounds of reviews when they had only ever done one historically. And that's like one of many anecdotes I can tell you here about my experience as a Latino man in the academy. And we have to work 2, 3 times as hard sometimes just to be recognized as being on the same level. And the thing is that that's a big risk to ask of people of color right now. Like, hey, just take these chances with this future that is beautiful, and and it's just a better way of doing things. And the thing is that, maybe some white males should take that chance in the beginning. It's a sad state of affairs. And at the end of the day, so it's a lot of gambits we're making around here, betting on tables, on blackjack tables, about what are going to be the winning numbers. And some bets are safer than others.
I think that's definitely a very good point, is that we don't want to sort of play with people's futures in the name of being of aspiring to meet some certain kinds of ideals, right? Ideals are great when you have tenure, but when people don't have tenure yet, we want to make sure they get tenure, and so we have to be very realistic and pragmatic as well. So I think that, well, I mean, one thing I think journal editors can do is make sure. I really admire the workflow that Archipelagos has. Diane and I have not developed anything like that, and I really admire how Joy said she had developed this a protocol for peer review with her editorial board. So I think that the more you can be transparent, maybe the more that can be a way of supporting people. I remember how terrified I was as a junior scholar to submit to that very journal that Joy was editing, the Journal of the American Musicological Society, and had to kind of like sign a blood pact with somebody else, that we would go ahead and submit, and we were so intimidated. And so the fact is, those intimidations, that's real. Those emotions are real, and so there needs to be less of that kind of thing, and there needs to be more understanding. Also, when I did publish with the journal editor, who's a perfectly nice man that some of us know and like, made me cut out part of my article. So my article left out significant amount of data that should have been in my article, and then it was all because of the length of the article. And then this is a journal which notoriously has been publishing longer and longer and longer articles. And then in the very next issue, a senior white male published an article twice the length of mine. But I had to cut out my data, which to this day is not published, that segment of my data. And it's actually had repercussions, because at a certain point, it's in my dissertation, somebody could find it, but at a certain point, somebody else was credited with the same data that I had actually already published in my dissertation, which of course is copyrighted, but it's not the same. So the point is that and then at the time, what I didn't understand was I should have opposed that wonderful senior white male colleague and just said to him, no, as somebody said to me, it's my way or the highway. I should have not, but you have this sense like you're so lucky to publish in this venerable journal that you'll just do anything if they'll just accept your article. And then years later, it's not it turns out to not have been so great to be so kind of what's the word I'm looking for, obedient. Anyway, so I think that there are many subject positions that we need to take into account. People who are contributing their scholarship and not getting any money for it by publishing in a journal should be empowered more than they are, I think, as authors. And also the journal editors should be more empowered.
I want to go back.
Sorry, go ahead. That institutions can help here, but it has to be a coordinated effort. It can't be just one or two elite institutions doing this, if there were clearer guidelines about how to evaluate scholarship, methods of review of scholarship in tenure and promotion packages, in hiring policies, in the faculty handbook, which I've read many faculty handbooks and many of these guidelines, and I have never seen anything detailed about like what is good. Sort of the prestige question is left fuzzy.
Yeah.
From back in the day when this was a club, a white male club, which we're trying to build an operation where we're workers, where we work, where we do scholarship, not a club, right? Yeah. At least that's the generation that I belong to. And I know this generation that preceded me in the academy is also moving in this direction where we see ourselves as people with jobs, not as members of a club. And the thing is that still, even today, we don't have that precise language. I think the transparency that we're trying to go for is actually helpful, might help lead into that world, into the world when we can spell it out. Yeah. Spell out like ways in which we could do open review in the faculty handbook, in the evaluation, where we say, look, you can demonstrate that you were part of this process or this other process. Both, let's say, like both processes are good. Double blind review is good, but also if you were part of a journal that does this best practices of open review, then yeah, sure, that counts too. Right. When we have that clarity, but as a coordinated effort from a university, because if it's only one, it's not helping the rest of us. Then I think that might be a path forward.
For the ACLS, for instance, or there's for a larger group, because the point is that quality should be quality. Quality shouldn't rest entirely on antiquated considerations or on bean counting. Now I see in the chat from V, the digital publishing at Columbia is doing such an excellent job, but I don't see that they have a policy on addressing caste discrimination. How do you address this? And then it says most South Asian studies, humanities, social science departments in the USA, the journals are dominated by Indian upper caste, and they will not address to caste diversity. Oh, this is an interesting thing that I'm not aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, do you have any thoughts on caste discrimination?
I do not. This is also something I wasn't aware of. It's something that I can certainly bring up with my editorial boards. The way that our policies are written on the journal websites is somewhat guided in that I talk with our editors about the need for us to have transparent policies, especially around, topics like diversity and inclusion, and making sure that we are addressing, conflict of interest, all the sort of different policies and transparent value setting that we want our communities to have. If this is something that hasn't been addressed, but I'm now hearing is an issue, I can certainly talk about it, particularly with our journals that are in relevant subject areas. But it's not something that I was aware of before.
This is an issue with journals that publish on South Asian materials. It's really important to understand the specific context under and disciplines under which we publish. So in this particular conversation, because we don't have South Asian or South Asianist representation in this group, this is a moot and irrelevant question. This is, of course, something that is important because I do know, Michelle, that you do work with some South Asian and South Asianist publications, that it is an important thing to consider. But this is how the different axes of difference when we talk about diversity are super important. Obviously, here in our conversation, we're going to focus on race and gender, since we have enough representation along those two axes or intersections there. But always there's a multiplicity of factors that we have to take into consideration. Of course.
I think factors that I always want to take into consideration are age. I think that sometimes scholars who are older are actually, like I said, with the submission platform, sometimes there's actual, it's almost a form of discrimination that people have to do to get their work to be submitted. And I also think another thing is to think about people, just socioeconomic diversity, people who don't have that whole kind of support system around them, whether for any kind of reasons, their social, their personal lives, or just socioeconomically, because there are some cases where people have to pay all kinds of fees. We discussed this last time, to pay permission fees, different kinds of costs. Articles come with costs. If you are a person who needs editing, sometimes in some cases, because English is not your first language, but you have to publish in English. There's so many situations in which people are compelled to cough up money in order to publish their work. And I feel like that is a really serious problem and a real serious barrier for many people, that institutions could help by making it more, by being more supportive of not only authors, but then, mainly authors, but also editors and other people. I think that there's just so many ways in which institutionally, I think people could be better supported to make the scholarship get published. And
Can I just oh, sorry, Susan. I was just thinking about one of the issues I find within the music department are issues of class and also conservatism. So if you are, depending on what you're studying, if you're studying more of a kind of traditional music discipline, such as Western music, I think that's seen as normalized and commonplace. I was just thinking about my own insecurity about publishing at Columbia, simply because I write about heavy metal. And but there is a certain consternation, like certain judgment that I receive because of what I study, and also that I am a journalist, I am not a practitioner. So and I think that they're not, like, outside of myself, there's other people who also might feel just insecure about what they, not insecure, like, confidence in terms of being at Columbia and studying what they want to study. But in comparison to working within these very conservative departments that tend to be more upper and middle class. Um, you're dealing with students who have been able to take lessons their entire lives on their instrument, who are able not to work in the summer so they can go to music camps. And then there's some other people that can't. And I think that also is kind of a deterrent in relation to getting people to think about submitting to various, not just current musicology, but other publications on campus, because they just feel like, well, is anyone going to care what I write? Is it valuable? Am I adding something to the conversation? And it would be nice to have open and honest conversations about, what is diversity? What is equity? What is inclusiveness? And how does it fit within our various disciplines? Because it will be a different application. But there's a resistance there that I find is more hindering than helpful in relation to just, trying to encourage students to take advantage of this opportunity, not just to get published, but also to go through the peer review process, through the editorial and revision process. That is extremely helpful when you get to the dissertation section of your life, where I have had to think about some of the stuff that I have seen or things that people have said to me while I'm writing my dissertation now. And having that editorial experience is super beneficial, but it's about thinking about ways to open it up so everyone feels like they have the same access to opportunity to learn these valuable skills for whatever they do or whatever they study in their lives.
Well, that's a very helpful point, that there's a real connection between people feeling included and welcome and people wanting to publish, wanting to participate in the scholarly conversation. I agree with you, by the way, about editing. It helps, one's writing benefits from editing. Editing is a very salutary. But yeah, I think this comes back to what Alex also was talking about, which is, how can we create a community in which people are truly welcome and empowered to do the work that they want to do. And that will, of course, then have the benefit of generating excellent scholarship, because people will feel they are authorized to write about the things that they're interested in writing about, and they'll feel that they have a place to publish their work and that their work will be received. So no, I think that would be maybe a great way to close the session, because I think that Lena's last word there was really kind of encapsulates what we should be striving for, is that a holistic way of thinking about this. This is education, it's research and publishing, it's education, and it's also a way of being together, of people working together and trying to live together and be together in this academic environment more harmoniously. So thank you for that, Lena. That was really, I appreciate that. I want to thank, so I think we're going to conclude because we're just a few minutes over. But if nobody has any further questions, I want to thank everybody who participated, who spoke in the panel, and who asked questions and made comments. And I want to thank again the Arts and Sciences, and very much thank you to the Hammond Center and the Society of Fellows, Kay Zhang and Lindsay Schramm, and everybody who has been involved in making this event happen and the publicity for it. And also again to Anya, because Anya has been really involved at many different levels as a kind of working, coordinating, making things all work together. So I hope that we'll do more of these. I think these are really, really interesting conversations that are giving me not only food for thought, but actually ideas for the future that are practical. So I hope that you'll join me for further future conversations.